The morning of the 3rd of July, 1915 began quietly at a house on the north shore of Long Island. A man sat at breakfast with his wife and the British ambassador. Somewhere past the dining room, a doorbell rang. The butler went to answer it. That was his work, one of 100 small duties that shaped his day. A caller stood on the step and asked to see the master of the house. When the butler hesitated, the man reached into his coat and drew 2 revolvers. Hold that picture for a moment. A single servant in a doorway, unarmed, facing a loaded gun. Behind him sat one of the wealthiest men in the country, and between that fortune and the barrel of a pistol stood nothing more than a butler and a staircase. It is tempting to imagine the great houses of this era as fortresses, thick walls and iron gates, windows wired to alarms, lawns paced by guards. The mansions were vast, the money almost past counting, and surely all that wealth bought a wall of protection to match. It did not. Not the way the legend tells it. When I went looking for the machinery of Gilded Age security, I expected vaults and alarm networks and hired armies. Some of that was real. But the deeper the reading went, the more a single plain fact kept rising to the surface. The thing that actually protected these families was not a device. It was people. The house was never empty. Cooks rose before dawn, maids moved along the halls, a watchman walked his rounds, and a butler waited at the door. Protection here was human, and it was everywhere, and it was watching, which meant the weakness was human too. Nearly every theft, every breach, every moment the wall gave way, came through a person rather than around one. It was the servant who was trusted, or the watchman who had quietly been paid. This is the story of how an entire class of people tried to keep the world out. It begins with a preacher who wired the front door with electricity. Along the way comes an architect who robbed banks for a living. Then a small boy, taken from a Philadelphia sidewalk in a case that frightened wealthy parents everywhere. At the end come men who mailed dynamite to the richest addresses in the country. And it starts where it must, on that summer morning, with the doorbell and the 2 revolvers waiting behind it. The house was never empty. Consider the man whose entire working life was the front door. In a great house of this period, the butler stood at the head of a small kingdom. A staff that might number 20 or more worked below him, each with a task and a place, and he answered for every one of them. The keys were his. He kept the wine, counted the silver, hired the footmen, and dismissed them. And in the first moment after a knock, he alone decided who crossed the threshold and who was sent back down the step. That last duty is easy to miss. When a caller arrived, the butler reached the door before anyone else, read the visitor in a single glance, and made a judgment no lock could make. A stranger who carried himself wrongly got no further than the mat. In an age before a telephone could screen a guest, the butler was the screen. He stood as the first line, and often the only line, between the family and whoever chose to climb the drive. The part that stays with me is the calling card. A visitor did not simply knock and walk in. He presented a card, the card was carried inside, and a decision came back out. The whole ritual was a filter run entirely by people, and it worked for one reason. Someone was always there to run it. That is the fact worth pausing on. Someone was always there. It is easy to picture these mansions as still and silent, their rooms waiting behind locked doors. Nothing could be further from the truth. A large household ran straight through the night and woke long before its owners did. Down in the kitchen, cooks lit the ranges while the sky was still black, starting a breakfast that lay hours away. Housemaids rose to clean the grates and set the fires before anyone upstairs had stirred. Dozens of lives moved under that roof, and they filled it at every hour of the day and night. The servants, after all, lived where they worked. Most of them slept in the house, and that single fact changed everything about the building as a target. A thief loves an empty house. He has all the time he needs, and no one to watch him use it. A mansion of this kind offered him nothing of the sort. Whatever hour he picked, someone was awake somewhere inside, carrying a lamp along a passage or turning over in a narrow bed. None of this was drawn up as a plan. Protection simply came free with the way these households were built. All those people moving constantly through the rooms and along the back stairs made the house a hard place to enter unseen. The staff were not guards in any real sense. They carried no weapons and kept no formal watch. Their plain presence, though, their endless motion through the halls, was the nearest thing the family had to a wall. At the center of that human wall stood the butler, and his strength was memory. Every face that belonged in the house was known to him, along with the tradesmen who called and the hours they were due. When a stranger appeared where none should be, he sensed it at once. To modern eyes, it is a strange kind of security. Protection, by the modern reflex, means hardware, something you buy and bolt to the wall and switch to life. The great houses had a little of that, and it comes later in this story. Their real defense, though, was softer and far older. It was a household that never slept, presided over by a man who missed nothing at the door. Which is exactly why that morning on Long Island matters. When the doorbell rang and the butler went to answer it, the old system was doing precisely what it had always done. A caller had come. A servant had gone to read him. The screening was running as it ran 1,000 times a year, and by every ordinary measure the house was as safe as money could buy. What no one at that door could know was how little it would matter. The instant the man on the step reached into his coat. The arrangement that had guarded these families for a generation was about to meet the one thing it was never made to stop. Understanding that morning, though, means stepping back from the doorway and looking hard at the house around it. The security, you could see. The first thing that guarded a great estate was the distance to it. Take Biltmore, the largest private house in the country, set in the mountains of North Carolina on 125,000 acres of forest. To reach the door, a visitor did not simply arrive. He traveled a road that ran for 3 miles, winding and slowly rising through dense woodland from the village below. The landscape architect who laid it out, Frederick Law Olmsted, screened it so heavily with plantings that the house stayed hidden the entire way. Not until the final bend did the great stone front appear, all at once, without warning. Olmsted built that road for drama, to make the arrival feel like a slow discovery. What I notice about it is the patience of the thing, the way it makes a guest wait. And the effect ran deeper than beauty. A journey of 3 miles by carriage took the better part of an hour. Guests were met by servants at the train station in Asheville and brought up from there. No stranger simply walked to the door of Biltmore. By the time anyone reached the house, they had already been expected and accompanied every mile of the way. This was the real logic of it. A rich man could not fence a forest. What he could do was control the single road that crossed it, and control who traveled that road, and meet them long before they arrived. The estate did not need a wall when it had distance and a gate, and at the bottom of the road stood exactly that. Beside the gate stood a lodge. The lodge looked charming, a small house of brick, the picturesque touch a wealthy man added to soften his grounds. It was also a checkpoint. Someone lived there whose duties included the gate, opening it for those who belonged and marking those who did not. The first line of defense on a great estate was a person in a small house watching the road. The house itself presented a hard face to the world. In the city, on Fifth Avenue, the mansions rose straight from the sidewalk in heavy stone. The lower floors were solid and closed, and the windows sat well above the reach of the street. The family did not live at ground level. They lived on the floor above, while the rooms nearest the pavement were given over to service and storage. A passerby looking up saw a wall of masonry and very little glass. The building met the street like a fortress, whether or not anyone had planned it that way, and there was only one proper way in. The front door belonged to the family and their guests. Everyone else used a separate service entrance, out of sight and watched by the staff. The tradesmen and the deliverymen, the whole daily traffic of a working household, came and went through there and nowhere else. The people who supplied the house never crossed the family's threshold. They passed through doors the servants held, into the world below stairs and no further, Which brings us to the most literal barrier of all. Outside Wilmington, a Dupont built a wall. Alfred Dupont enclosed his estate at Namur behind stone some 9 feet high, running for thousands of feet around the grounds. Along the top he set broken glass, jagged shards fixed upright in cement. Local boys were paid a penny for every bottle they gathered, and the bottles were smashed and pressed into the mortar to form the crown of the wall. The story everyone repeats is that he built it to keep out his own relatives. The Duponts had torn themselves apart in a fight for control of the family company. Alfred had come out the loser, and the wall went up soon after. He is said to have joked that it stood to keep the other Duponts on the far side of the glass. But the truth is less certain and more interesting for it. His widow, years later, laughed at the idea. The wall was simply the French style, she said, the way a Louis XVI chateau was meant to be finished. The glass was fashion, not fear, and that is the strange thing about the security you could see. Even the highest wall in the story, the one barrier no one could miss, left people arguing over who it was meant to keep out. The distance, the gate, the stone, the glass, every piece of it faced outward, toward the stranger on the road. None of it faced the doorway, where a caller had only to ring the bell. 3 minutes on the 3rd of July. The night before he came to the house, he had bombed the Capitol. Late on the 2nd of July, 1915, an explosion tore through a reception room in the United States Capitol. It shattered plaster and blew out transoms, though the room stood empty and no one was hurt. The man who set it was already on a train heading north. His next stop was a house on Long Island. He called himself Frank Holt. The real name was Erich Munter, and he had once taught German at Harvard. He lived under a false name because he was suspected of poisoning his wife some years earlier. In his suitcase he carried newspaper clippings against the arms trade and a few sticks of dynamite. In his coat he carried 2 revolvers. He had chosen his target for a reason. The House of Morgan was the purchasing agent for Britain and France. It bought the guns and shells that fed the war in Europe and lent the money to pay for them. To a man consumed by that war, the banker was the war made flesh. And so he came to the door. On the morning of the 3rd of July, the family was at breakfast at Matnecock Point, their estate on East Island near Glen Cove. The British ambassador was a house guest and sat with them. It was an ordinary summer morning, in a house that was anything but ordinary. Then the doorbell rang. The butler went to answer it. His name was Physic, and this was the very duty he had performed in the opening minutes of this story. A caller stood on the step, a lanky man who held out a business card and asked to see the master of the house. Here is the moment I keep returning to. The card. The filter that the first chapter described was running exactly as it was built to run. A stranger had come. The butler was reading him, and by every rule of the house the next step was a courteous refusal. Physic balked because the man would not state his business, and it changed nothing at all. The visitor reached into his coat and drew both revolvers, one in each hand. What happened next owed nothing to an alarm or a guard. It was people, moving through a house that was full of them. The butler did not run. He backed up the staircase, calling out, drawing the household toward the danger and away from where the family sat. Somewhere in those rooms the intruder came upon 2 of the children and turned a pistol on them, forcing them to walk ahead of him. The house, so full of life, had filled in an instant with everyone the gunman might use. He found the financier on the stairs. His wife threw herself into the man's path, and her husband pulled her back and went at the intruder himself. Morgan was a big man, far heavier than the slight professor. He drove him to the floor. The revolver went off twice as they struggled, and both shots caught the banker low, in the thigh and the abdomen. But he did not let go. Now the butler was on them, and together they twisted the guns away. The man broke loose once and nearly reached a door before the household ran him down. Within minutes he was in the hands of the Glen Cove police. The wounds were serious. Glen Cove had no hospital, so a local doctor came and dressed them as best he could, while a specialist raced out from the city. One bullet had passed clean through the thigh. The other, the one that frightened everyone, had gone into the abdomen, and in the days before antibiotics, a wound like that could kill by infection alone. From his bed, the banker asked for a telephone and called his mother so that she would hear the news from him first. He recovered. By August, he was back at his desk. His attacker did not last the week. On the evening of the 6th of July, in the county jail at Mineola, Munter went headfirst from an upper tier to the concrete floor below and died. Now hold the whole scene in mind, because it is the argument of this film compressed into a single morning. Here was the best defended household in America. And when the danger finally came through the door, nothing mechanical saved a soul. There was no guard on the lawn, no alarm that mattered. What saved the family was a butler who would not run and a heavy man who would not let go. The Gold Coast took the lesson at once and took the wrong half of it along with the right. Guards went up at Matneecock Point and at the neighboring estates almost overnight. The rich reached for more hardware, more men at the gate. But the thing that had actually worked that morning was not something you could post at a fence. It was already inside the house, and it always had been. To see what they had trusted before that morning, the story goes back 40 years, to the one machine a wealthy family believed could watch the house for them. The alarm that faced inward. Long before any of that, a country minister found a way to make a house sound its own alarm. In the 1850s, in a small town near Boston, a congregational preacher named Augustus Pope worked out how to wire a house with electricity. When a door or a window opened, a current closed, and a bell rang. It was the first practical burglar alarm, and it came not from a locksmith or an engineer, but from a clergyman tinkering in his spare hours. Pope patented it in 1853, and a few years later he sold the rights to a man who would turn it into an industry. That man was Edwin Holmes. He bought the patent and moved his business to New York, for the plain reason that the city was, as he saw it, where the country kept its burglars. His customers were exactly the people you would expect. By the end of the 1860s, his list ran past 1,000 names, and it read like a directory of the richest families in America. But the alarm was more than a bell. Its cleverness was a device called the annunciator. A plain bell only told you that something, somewhere, had opened. The annunciator told you where. A small panel, usually set in the owner's own bedroom, showed which door or window had been disturbed. A man woken in the dark knew at once whether the sound came from the pantry or the library below. And the whole system was invisible. The wires were fine copper, wound with cotton and painted the color of the woodwork, and they were laid in grooves cut into the floorboards beneath the carpets. A special tool scored the channels. Nothing showed. A visitor could stand in a wired room, the company liked to boast, and see nothing but the bell. The house watched, and gave no sign that it was watching. It could even be divided. The alarm could be set for part of a house and not the rest. A family giving a party downstairs with guests filling the public rooms could leave the empty floors above, armed and listening. The rich did not simply buy a bell. They bought a machine that could be tuned to the shape of an evening. Here is where the story turns, and where I had to correct my own assumption. I had taken the alarm to face outward, the way a lock does, against the stranger on the street. It did not. In 1867, Holmes patented a clock. Its purpose was to disconnect one part of the circuit at a set hour and connect it again later. And the part it disconnected was the servants' doors in the early morning. The maids and the cooks could then begin their work without the alarm waking the house. Think about what that means. The machine had to be built around the staff. Their comings and goings were a thing to be scheduled into the circuit and managed, and the sales pitch went further still. Connect the alarm, the company urged, to the silver closet and the locked drawers where the jewelry lay. Then no servant or guest could open them without ringing the bell. The alarm was sold, in plain words, as a way to watch the people already inside the house. You can still see this today in the houses that kept their systems. At Beechwood, the Astor Cottage in Newport, an old annunciator survives. In Connecticut, at the Lockwood Mansion, the little labeled knobs are still in place, and they still carry the names of the children who slept in those rooms. The control panel of a Gilded Age alarm was a map of the household, room by room, name by name. It knew where everyone belonged, and it was built to notice when someone did not. There is one last turn, and it is a strange one. In 1872, the company opened the first central station for burglar alarms. It was a single office where wires from many houses came together, and an operator waited for a signal. To carry all those wires, Holmes's son made a discovery. The alarm lines could share the new telephone cables being strung across the city. Before long, the son was running a Bell telephone company himself. The wiring first laid to guard the mansions of the rich had quietly become part of the telephone network the whole country would come to use. And yet, for all its cleverness, the machine still could not act. It could only ring. Somewhere a person still had to hear the bell and go and look. Which brings the story back to the people the alarm was built to watch and to guard in the same breath. Who were they? A house full of strangers. The protection of a great house rested on a contradiction. The house was full of people, and the family knew almost nothing about most of them. Everything in this story so far has depended on that crowd, on the fact that a great house was always full of people. That was its safety. But look closely at who those people were, and the comfort starts to fade. Service was one of the largest kinds of work in the city. By one estimate, close to a sixth of the whole population worked in some household or other. Most were immigrants, and mostly Irish and German, many of them young women fresh off the boat, taking the first work they could find. They came in through an agency or an advertisement. Within a day or two they were living in the house, sleeping under its roof, moving among the silver and the sleeping children. A single household could hold 20 of them or more. Below stairs ran a whole hierarchy, from the butler and the housekeeper at the top down to the scullery girls at the bottom. A manual for running a rich household, published around 1900, set out every rank and every wage. It was a small institution in itself, and the family at its center had hired most of its members on the strength of a single sheet of paper. That sheet was the character. When a servant left one position for another, the former employer wrote a letter vouching for the servant's honesty and skill. The new employer read this character, and if it satisfied, the servant was taken on. That was the whole of it. There was no other check, no way to know whether the letter was true, or whether the last house had simply wanted quiet rid of someone. A good character on paper was the only wall between the family and whoever had answered the advertisement. And the paper was forever changing hands, because servants rarely stayed. The newspapers were full of what they called the servant question, the endless lament that good help could not be found or kept. Servants left for better pay, or simply because the work was hard and the hours long. Every departure meant another stranger hired, another new face admitted to the house on another letter. The suspicion ran deeper than the servants, all the way to the one guard the family actually paid. The night watchman was himself not trusted to do his job, and so a machine was built to check him. He carried a clock, slung over his shoulder, and at points all around the house stood stations, each with its own key. As he made his rounds, he turned the key at each station into the clock, and the clock stamped the hour onto a paper dial inside. In the morning his employer could read that dial and see exactly where the watchman had been and when. It showed, too, whether he had walked the whole route or dozed in a warm corner. The family that could not truly vet its servants had at least found a way to keep its watchman honest, but even that machine misread the danger. It was built to catch a lazy guard rather than a thieving one, and it assumed the worst a watchman would do was sleep. The worst he could actually do was rob the house he was paid to protect, and no paper dial would ever catch that. For proof, step forward in time, all the way to 1980. At Biltmore, that vast estate in the mountains, the staff discovered that rare books were missing from the library. There were more than 200 of them, worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. The theft was so large that the investigation climbed to the federal level. And when the agents looked for a suspect, they found one close at hand. The estate's own night watchman, the man hired to guard the house through the dark hours, kept a second business on the side. He was an antiquarian bookbinder with a shop in town. When I read how that case was solved, I had to sit with it for a moment. The man paid to protect the collection was the man quietly selling it off. He pleaded guilty. This is the truth the whole system kept circling and never quite faced. The household that protected the family was built from people the family could not really know. Every defense they raised came down to the same wager. Each one assumed you could tell the trusted from the dangerous. Again and again, you could not. The danger so far has worn a familiar shape. It is the insider who goes bad on his own, the servant or the watchman who yields to temptation. But a colder kind of threat was abroad in these years. Somewhere out in the city was a man who did not wait for an insider to turn. He recruited one, and he had made a science of it. The architect. He was a respected New York architect. To the police, he was also the most prolific bank robber in the country, and almost no one alive knew that these were the same man. His name was George Leslie. He had trained as an architect in Ohio, built a good practice, then closed it and come to New York around 1869. In the city he moved through polite society as a cultured man of taste, a welcome guest at the best tables. What his hosts did not know was that the police had another name for him. They called him the king of the bank robbers, and they believed his hand lay behind the great majority of bank thefts in America. He was not the sort of robber the age was used to. The common thief came with dynamite and a match, and hoped to survive the blast. Leslie worked the other way. He read a bank the way an architect reads a building, studying its plans and its weak points. In time, he understood it better than the men who ran it. And he had a device. It was a small metal disc, and he called it the Little Joker. Placed behind the dial of a combination lock, it recorded the numbers as the lock was worked, so that the combination quietly gave itself up. But the Joker had to be set in place, and later retrieved, and for that, Leslie needed a man on the inside. So he put one there. He arranged for a member of his own circle to be hired onto a bank staff, an ordinary employee going about ordinary duties, who was in truth his instrument. This is what set Leslie apart from every insider in this story so far. He did not wait for a trusted servant to weaken and turn. His own man was planted from the start. Betrayal became something he could arrange in advance, built into the plan like a doorway. His masterpiece was to be the Manhattan Savings Institution. He spent 3 years on it, breaking in more than once in secret to learn the vault. In the spring of 1878, he opened the outer safe at last. It was to be the largest robbery the country had ever seen. He did not live to see it. In the months before the job, his own gang turned on him, for reasons that were never proven, though suspicion fell on the men closest to him. His body was found in the woods near Yonkers, shot twice, partly hidden under the brush. He was 36. And months later, in the autumn, the gang carried out his plan without him, and robbed the bank of a fortune, exactly as the dead architect had designed. The Little Joker had shown the banks something frightening, that the combination itself could no longer be trusted, because a clever man could make it betray its owner. And there was worse. In those same years, a wave of robbers had taken to a simpler method still. They kidnapped the banker himself and forced him to open his own vault in the dark. The lock was only as strong as the man who knew the secret, and a man could be broken. The answer came from a locksmith in Rochester named James Sargent. In 1873, he built the first practical time lock. It was a clock fixed inside the vault door, and it was beautifully simple in what it refused to do. Once set, the vault would not open until the appointed hour arrived, and nothing could hurry it. Not the right combination. Not even a gun held to the head of the man who knew every secret the bank possessed. The time lock could not be reasoned with or frightened because it did not know or care who was asking. The time lock is the one moment in this whole story where I think the machine truly won. And it won for a single reason. It removed the person altogether. There was no longer anyone who could open the vault before its hour, which meant there was no longer anyone worth bribing or seizing in the night. Bankers resisted it at first, uneasy with a lock that shut out friend as surely as foe. Then the proof arrived. In 1875, in Great Barrington, a gang seized a banker's family in their home and demanded that he open his vault. He could not have done it if he had wished. A time lock had been installed only days before, and it simply would not move. The robbers made their threats, and in the end they left with nothing. They harmed no one. A clock had defeated them. For the vault, then, there was finally an answer. Seal it with time, and no bribe or threat could reach inside. But a vault was a box that could be shut against the whole world. A family could not. A child walking home could not. And in these very same years, someone had already understood that, and had reached not for a fortune, but for a living person. A boy on a sidewalk in Philadelphia. It began, as the worst things sometimes do, on an ordinary afternoon, with two small boys playing in their front yard. The yard belonged to a comfortable house in Germantown, a well-to-do part of Philadelphia. Two brothers were playing there, 4-year-old Charlie and his older brother Walter. For several days a wagon had been passing by, carrying two friendly men who gave the boys candy. On the 1st of July in 1874, the men offered a ride to buy fireworks for the coming 4th. The boys climbed up happily. At a shop along the way, Walter was handed a coin and sent inside to buy his firecrackers. When he came back out, the wagon was gone, and the little boy was gone with it. Charlie was never seen again. There is a bitter irony in what came next. The house looked like wealth, but the family had been badly hurt by the financial crash of the year before. The father, a dry goods merchant, was deep in debt. So when the ransom demand came, he could not have met it even had he chosen to. The kidnappers wanted $20,000, a sum worth several $100,000 today. They pressed it in a series of 23 letters, the first of them deliberately misspelled. The police urged him not to pay, and so did his friends. To give in, they feared, would teach every criminal in the country a terrible lesson, that a child could be turned into money. The father agreed and refused to pay. And for that refusal, in one of the cruelest turns of the whole affair, some people began to suspect him. They whispered that a man who would not ransom his own son must be hiding something. What followed was the first nationwide search for a missing child in the country's history. The Pinkerton Agency took up the case. 700,000 circulars went out across the land, carrying the boy's face into every town, and hundreds of false sightings poured back. At one point, the father was sent on a desperate midnight train journey, a case of money at his side. He waited for a signal to throw it from the moving car. The signal never came. The one apparent break came 5 months later, and it broke nothing. In December, 2 burglars were shot while robbing a house in Brooklyn. The owner's brother lived next door, saw the crime, and came in with armed men. One burglar died at once. The other, mortally wounded, confessed as he lay dying that he and his partner had been the ones who took the boy. But he said his partner, already dead on the floor beside him, had been the only one who knew where the child was held. Then he died too. The confession gave the crime 2 names and took away, in the same breath, any hope of an answer. And whether those men truly did it was never actually proven. Charlie was never found. Of all the stories in this film, this is the one I find hardest to tell, because it does not end. It only stops. The father spent the rest of his life searching, and a fortune with it. He wrote a book about his lost son, and turned away a parade of grown men who claimed to be the child. In the end, he died still looking. There was no body, and no answer. Only an absence where a little boy had been. But the case changed something in the country, and it changed the most in the houses of the rich. Everything so far had been built around the house and its contents. A wall to stop the stranger, a vault to seal the silver behind a clock, but a child was not kept behind a wall or a clock. A person could be lifted from the safest-looking yard in broad daylight, and no lock yet made could prevent it. The wealthy understood this at once, because they had the most to lose and the most that could be demanded for its return. They began to guard their children the way they guarded their valuables. The nursemaid and the governess became something more than servants, a set of watchful eyes on a child at every hour. Families learned to send a son or a daughter nowhere alone. and the private detectives who had hunted for Charlie, the Pinkertons, became the name a frightened household reached for. That agency was about to become something far larger than a finder of lost children. In the hands of the men at the very top, the ones with fortunes to defend and enemies to match, the hired detective was turning into a private army. The story of protection was about to stop looking like a guard at a door and start looking like a war. The men you hired At its height, the largest private police force in America was bigger than the United States Army. That force was the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. It had begun in 1850 as a modest detective outfit, the same agency that would later hunt for missing children and lost fortunes. But it had grown into something without any real precedent, a private army available for hire, and it had made a specialty of one line of work in particular. For a fee, the Pinkertons would slip into a union and break a strike from within. The name a frightened family called to guard a child was also an army a rich man could rent. In the summer of 1892, one of the richest men in the country decided to use it. The place was Homestead, a steel town on the Monongahela River near Pittsburgh, and the mill there belonged to Andrew Carnegie. He himself was away in Scotland, and the man running the works was his manager, Henry Clay Frick, who meant to break the union for good. He locked out the entire workforce, thousands of men, and ringed the mill with a high fence topped with barbed wire. The workers bitterly named it Fort Frick. Then came the advertisements for the replacements who would take their jobs. The town did not wait quietly. Its workers organized themselves almost like a garrison, posting pickets in shifts and patrolling the river. A signal system stood ready to sound the alarm the moment anything moved toward the mill. Both sides were preparing for a fight, and both sides knew it. To seize the plant and let his replacements in, Frick turned to that agency. He hired 300 of them, armed with rifles. Before dawn on the 6th of July, they came up the Monongahela on 2 covered barges. The plan was to land on mill property, where any resistance would count as trespass. But the river was being watched. As the barges came into view, the alarm went up, and thousands of workers and their families ran down to the bank. What happened at the landing was less a strike than a battle. As the barges reached the shore, gunfire broke out, and which side fired the first shot was never settled. A fight followed that lasted some 13 hours, the crowd on the bank against the hired men pinned on the water. There is a figure here I had to read twice. By the time it ended, as many as a dozen men were dead, workers and agents alike, and dozens more lay wounded on both sides. At last the hired men surrendered, on the promise of safe passage out of the town. The promise did not hold. As the beaten men were marched up from the river, the furious crowd closed in and set upon them, and the barges were burned behind them. It was a savage scene, and it cost the strikers dearly. Much of the country had leaned toward the workers until that day. The sight of surrendered men being beaten turned a great deal of that sympathy away, and here the whole idea of hired protection ran into its limit. The private army had failed. 300 armed men had not been enough to take the mill, and Frick now reached for the only force larger than the one he had already bought. He reached for the state. At the governor's order, 8,500 soldiers of the state militia marched into Homestead and occupied the town. Under their protection, the mill reopened with replacement workers, and in the long months that followed, the union was broken. This is what the men you hired became at the far end of the idea. Protection had started small in this story, a butler reading a caller at a door, a watchman turning his key in the dark. In the hands of the very richest, it had swelled into a private army firing on citizens from the deck of a barge, and Homestead exposed the ceiling of the whole arrangement. A rich man could buy a great many guns. He could not buy enough to win a war outright. For that, in the end, he still needed the government and its soldiers, and the public force proved stronger than any private one he could assemble. But even as the smoke cleared over the river, a new kind of danger was taking shape, one that no army could meet, whether hired or sworn. The men who had fought on that bank wanted something plain and human. They wanted their jobs and their wages back. The man who would climb the stairs to Frick's office 2 weeks later wanted nothing of the sort. No wage would satisfy him, and no job. He had come only to kill. The threat with no face. Every threat in this story so far had come with a demand. The thief wanted the silver behind the wall. The kidnapper wanted his ransom. Even the strikers on the riverbank had wanted something plain: their wages and their jobs. Each of those demands, in principle, could be answered. You could raise the cost of reaching the silver, or you could pay the price asked. But now a different kind of man appeared at the door, and he wanted nothing that could be handed to him. He wanted only to make a point and to write it in another man's blood. The first of them walked into Frick's office 2 weeks after Homestead. He was a young anarchist named Alexander Berkman, and he had no connection to the Union at all. He forced his way in, shot the manager, and stabbed him with a sharpened file. Frick's own clerks and workmen wrestled him to the floor and beat him senseless. The manager lived and was back at his desk within the week. And here is the bitter heart of it. Berkman had struck his blow for the workers, or so he believed, but the workers wanted no part of him. The labor movement condemned the attack, and the act he imagined would rouse the masses won him nothing but a long sentence in a prison cell. This was a different order of danger, and every defense in this film had been built for the wrong one. The wall, the alarm, the vault, the private army, all of them assumed an enemy who wanted something. Each imagined a price that could be raised or a bargain that could be struck. A man who wanted only to kill you, and did not care whether he died in the act, had no price and would strike no bargain. He was the threat with no face. There was no ransom note to answer, and no deal to be made. In the years that followed, this new violence found its cause in the war between labor and capital. That spring, in 1914, at a place called Ludlow in Colorado, the state militia attacked a tent colony of striking coal miners and their families. The mine belonged to the Rockefellers, and when the shooting and the fire were over, some 24 people were dead, women and children among them. The rage that Ludlow raised turned on the most famous fortune in the country. Anarchists led angry protests against Rockefeller in New York. Then they carried the protests north to the gates of his estate at Tarrytown, where the police met them with clubs and arrests. Out of that anger came a plot. A small group of anarchists began gathering dynamite in a tenement apartment in Harlem, meaning to carry a bomb to the Rockefeller home at Tarrytown. On the 4th of July, 1914, the bomb went off early, in the very room where they were assembling it. The blast killed the men who were building it. It also killed a woman who lived there and had no part in the plot, and it tore the top floors off the tenement. The bomb meant for the richest man in America killed only its makers and one innocent stranger. Still, the dynamite kept coming. A year and a half later, in November of 1915, another Standard Oil man became the target. His name was Archbold, and someone had buried 4 sticks of dynamite in a rut in the driveway of his estate. The charge was wired to explode the instant his automobile wheel rolled over it. The whole device was wrapped in a piece of paper matching the exact color of the gravel. No eye passing over it would ever see it lying there. No machine caught it. If this film has a single image, it is this one. What caught it was a man, the estate's gardener, John Walquist. He knew that driveway the way he knew his own hands, and he saw that something in it was wrong. The most carefully hidden weapon in this whole story, built to be invisible to everyone, was found by a gardener walking the grounds he tended every day. The threat had changed for good. It no longer came for the silver or the child. Now it came for the man himself, driven by a fury that no wall could shut out and no fortune could buy away. And it was building toward a single terrible morning. The bombs would arrive not at one lonely driveway, but at dozens of the richest doors in the country, all on the same day. In the end, the threat lost its face entirely. In the spring of 1919, someone mailed 36 bombs at once. They went to senators and judges, and to the richest men in the country, Rockefeller among them, all in neat parcels disguised as gifts from a department store. It was the nightmare the whole age had been building toward, the enemy who wanted nothing, sent not to one door, but to dozens on the same day. And here is how most of them were stopped. Not by a wall or a guard. A clerk in a New York post office read about the one bomb that had gone off. He remembered a stack of parcels he had set aside days before because the postage on them was short. Those were pulled at once, and more were caught before they could be delivered. The deadliest attack yet on the American rich was undone in large part by a postal rule and a clerk who paid attention. There is a smaller, sadder truth folded inside it. The rich did not open their own mail. A servant did. The single bomb that reached its mark maimed the maid who opened it, not the man whose name was on the envelope. Even at the very end, the household stood between the family and the danger and paid the price for it. The following autumn brought the last act. On a September day in 1920, a horse and wagon stopped in the noon crowd outside the Morgan Bank on Wall Street. The wagon was packed with dynamite and iron, and when it went off it killed nearly 40 people and wounded hundreds. Almost none of them were financiers. They were clerks and messengers, the ordinary people of the street, cut down by a bomb meant for a symbol. No one was ever caught. The marks the blast tore into the stone of that building are still there, left unrepaired to this day. That was the shape of the new danger, and no butler at a door could meet it. So protection moved. It left the household and went into the institution, into the vault and the central alarm station, and it moved into the federal agency that now hunted the men who left wagons in the street. The guard at the gate gave way to the system, and there it has remained ever since. And yet, strip away the 100 years of machinery, and the oldest truth in this story is still standing. It has surprised me writing this, how the answer never changed. The bomb hidden in the driveway was caught by a gardener. The bombs hidden in the mail were caught by a clerk. The vault and the alarm were only ever as good as the person who was paying attention. The great houses were never truly kept safe by their walls. The walls were only stone. What kept them was the people inside, the ones who were always there and always watching, who noticed when something did not belong. That was the whole secret. The security was never the lock on the door. It was the man who